You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
It's April 30th, 1948, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
A go-anywhere vehicle, a source of portable power, was how the Land Rover was launched at the Amsterdam Motor Show today in history in 1948, the debut of one of Britain's biggest ever motoring marques.
Yeah, and the 3 units that were displayed on this day were pre-production models, and they actually got their first real-world test before the show because they were driven to Amsterdam. They weren't taken on trucks or trailers or on a train the way you imagine they would. People actually just drove them there.
There was a boat involved, I presume. Land Rovers aren't that clever.
Land, there's a clue in the name.
But it was a really exciting exhibit to be able to see because at this time there were no 4x4 off-road vehicles in Britain. The closest thing that farmers had were tractors. But for most people, even, we'll get into it, but Maurice Wilks, who designed the Land Rover, he was using an ex-American Army Jeep on his own farm because that was the nearest possible alternative, which is sort of what gave him the idea that Rover could get into this business because Rover at that point was still very much seen as a luxury car brand.
Yeah, the apocryphal story goes that in 1947, Maurice Wilks, who was this very experienced automotive engineer and the chief designer at Rover, was at his holiday home in Anglesey in Wales. And in a moment of pure inspiration, he took a stick and sketched the idea of this new utility vehicle in the sand for his brother Spencer, who was the managing director at Rover.
Always handy.
Yeah.
He could have drawn any old thing, you get the sense.
He could have invented the fridge, but it would have been no use.
Right. But he'd been using, as you say, this old American Willys Jeep on his farm, and he found it to be just not as reliable and felt that Rover could build something better. And I must say, if there's any truth to this story, and he did draw something in the sand, the thing he drew was basically just a Willys Jeep,
yes.
Because that's definitely what the Land Rover Series 1 that was shown in Amsterdam looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at this first generation of Land Rover Defenders and compare it to the Willys Overland post-war Jeep from the United States, really the only difference is that the tyre is on the bonnet rather than in the back. Right. Otherwise, the silhouette is identical. And that's kind of fine, isn't it? If you're not taking your origin story that you had this incredible brainwave that Rover should branch out into military-style rural vehicles and actually are not covering up for the fact that you have been using a Jeep at home. You're one of the few people in Britain who has a Jeep. And you've got a problem because at Rover, the business has to pivot. You've been making bomber engines during the war. Ain't much call for those in 1948. Steel has been rationed, but there's loads of aluminium hanging around and gallons of RAF green paint. So put all those things together and you can see why they thought, why don't we just do a version of this Jeep that we've been using, but correcting all the things I don't like?
Yeah, and nobody was buying luxury cars. Obviously, post-war austerity Britain was not a great market if you're selling luxurious saloons. As you mentioned, raw materials were still subject to rationing, and metal for a luxury car was not a priority. But one surefire way to get hold of metal during these times was to produce something that could be exported, because Britain's economy was so shot that metal reserves were given as a priority to companies who were producing things that could be exported abroad. And the less developed areas of the empire / the Commonwealth were kind of a ready-made market. If you think you've already got got all of these British expats who are living, in rural Australia or South Africa. This is an ideal market for them, because the beauty of the Land Rover was that it wasn't just for use on farms. It was also great for any kind of off-road terrain. So if you're living, in a farm in the middle of Botswana, just getting to the nearest town, this is the vehicle for you. So immediately it was seen this is something that could start bringing some money into Britain, which was desperately needed at the time.
Yeah, and I think that multi-purpose aspect of the vehicle was why it was such an immediate hit. It ended up being used, yes, for agricultural work, the way that the Wilks brothers had imagined, but also it was taken up by police forces and military organizations and aid workers in remote places and travelers who were now able to go out and explore. And so you had just this instant hit of a vehicle.
Well, also, a bit like the Mini, that other British design that we've talked about before on the show. One of the things about the Land Rover, which is perhaps surprising given that it comes from our class-ridden society in Britain, is that it is kind of classless. The Land Rover very quickly, even though it imitated what you'd imagine sort of army sergeant majors to be driving around in, at the same time, I guess because it had that American influence, and I guess because it's a rural vehicle, so then suddenly, people who are working people on the land are using it for practical purposes to get around as well. It just had that feeling of something you'd aspire to, but it wasn't pretentious. And that felt very post-war, didn't it?
Yeah.
Bob Marley had one, Winston Churchill had one. The great train robbers used theirs as getaway vehicles. There's a famous picture of Marilyn Monroe posing in one. The Duke of Edinburgh was laid to rest in one. So, it's kind of like everybody's car. And I think that's part of the reason why it lasted so long.
Yeah, and the version of the Land Rover that debuted on this day, later known as the Series 1, was very much a farm vehicle. The base model had no heater, no roof, and it only had half doors. If you imagine, like a World War II Jeep, they don't actually have doors. You just sort of leap in and out of them.
Yeah.
This one had half doors, but otherwise just a hole exposed to the elements. There was also no seat padding on the passenger seat. And actually, the first prototype had a steering wheel that was mounted in the centre of the dashboard, like a tractor.
That's
so you
nuts,
had space,
isn't it?
Yeah, well, the idea was that you're using it on a farm. You're probably not giving your friends a lift anywhere in it. You're using it to transport machinery, implements, a big churn of milk possibly from one place to another.
A sheep.
So, and also, sheep, if you one on either side, easily. The idea was that farmers were going to be driving it, so it should be set up like a tractor. And you can kind of see that as well in one of the features that Wilks pinched from tractors and put into his design for the Land Rover, which was the power takeoff, which is a drive shaft on the vehicle which you can hook up to a piece of machinery, and then that's powered from the vehicle's engine, which, as you can imagine, is very useful if you're in the middle of a field. And the initial batch, I was curious to kind of get a grasp on what kind of price range these were in for the time. So the initial batch of 48 Land Rovers went on the market for £450 each. For comparison, Rover's cheapest saloon car at the time cost £800, although you could get something more modest like a Ford Anglia for about £300. So they weren't ultra cheap, but if you're looking at this as an investment for your farm, then it's very affordable.
It's astonishing, isn't it, that this was meant to be just a temporary project for Rover? Well, we need something to get past the war and then we'll go back to building the old cars that we always did. But it became such a successful product that it not only outsold their traditional cars, but by the 1950s, Rover had so embraced Land Rover that they'd had to expand the model lineup and produce loads of different vehicles that were meant to be used in different contexts, for farmers or explorers or military forces or whatever. And by the 1970s, they actually renamed the company Land Rover Limited, basically to recognize that this now was who they were. They weren't the Rover of old. I mean, the Rover of very old was actually a bicycle manufacturer, but it then quickly went into automobiles.
My dad had a Rover. I'm not sure that wasn't always their strength.
Yeah. But then by 1976, the 1 millionth Land Rover rolled off the assembly line in Solihull, Birmingham.
Despite the fact, may I be the first to say it, we were praising it as a design classic, yes, but it is noisy, leaky, creaky. It is uncomfortable. If you get past about 50 miles per hour, it's so loud in the cabin, you can't hear any music and you can't speak. It rains on you. It's just fascinating, isn't it, that people have this nostalgic attachment to the vehicle. I like them. I'd happily own one.
Yeah.
But they're not comfortable. They're just practical and cool.
But you talk about it, Olly, as the great leveller, like a classless car. But I actually think that curious coming together in Britain of aristocracy and like farming. The true aristocrats, like the king and queen, they're like country people. They like getting out and shooting ducks and hunting foxes and driving around.
I saw someone wrote a tweet about this. I can't remember who it was, I'm afraid. So if you're listening, apologies. But someone made the observation on social media, and I thought, yes, that's absolutely right, that Americans, when they imagine posh British people, imagine them being chauffeured around in Rolls Royces. But actually, the poshest people you'll ever meet have a battered up old Saab with a load of dog biscuits on the passenger seat. That's actually the aesthetic, isn't it?
And that was, Queen Elizabeth's happy place was driving around in the countryside in her beaten up old, well, actually probably a reinforced Range Rover, really. But it had that image of being like the royal car, but royal in the sense of the royals when they let their hair down.
The other place, obviously, that Land Rover gathered pace was as a military vehicle, which is fascinating because the Wilks brothers did not intend for this to be a military vehicle. It was a military-style vehicle inspired by what they'd just been through in the war. But they had no intention of selling it to the British Army. It was, as we've said, for rural workers. But the British Army bought some in 1949, and then it became, I guess, almost a symbol of the British Army all over the world, right up to the Iraq War. And it was only after soldiers started asking for something more protected for their patrols, because in Iraq you were getting attacked when you were supposed to be patrolling civilians, and there was nothing to the thing. It's not a tank. And if you put modern armour on it, it was too heavy and it couldn't cope with that. That they started phasing it out. But it, again, lasted all that time, basically 50 years as a military car.
It's funny to think that the one thing that they didn't think that their vehicle that was based on a military vehicle could be used for was military purposes.
To hear more from us on this topic, join Club Retrospectors now. Unlock our weekly bonus bits at patreon.com/retrospectors.